The courthouse buzzed with the restless hum of a Monday morning, its grand marble corridors alive with the hurried shuffle of polished shoes against the gleaming floor. Lawyers in crisp suits darted past, clutching briefcases stuffed with papers, their minds racing through arguments and counterpoints. Clerks darted between offices, arms piled high with files, their faces etched with the exhaustion of endless bureaucracy. Uniformed officers lingered near the edges, their postures rigid, eyes scanning the crowd with a mix of boredom and suspicion. The air carried a faint tang of stale coffee, mingled with the sharp scent of ink and the musty weight of old paper, a smell that clung to the walls like a permanent resident. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, casting long, slanted beams across the floor, illuminating flecks of dust that danced in the air. It was a place built to uphold justice, but beneath its stately veneer, an undercurrent of tension simmered, a silent acknowledgement that power here was not always fair, not always kind. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a scene unfolded that would soon ripple through the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Officer Daniel Hayes stood at the center of it, his broad frame towering over a young black man sprawled helplessly on the cold marble. Jamal Robinson, just 23, had been pacing the corridor moments earlier, his voice rising in frustration as he argued with a clerk over a summons he swore was a mistake. His words had been loud, sharp, cutting through the usual din, but they carried no threat, only the raw edge of a man tired of being dismissed. To Daniel, though, that was enough. The officer's instincts, honed by years of unchecked authority, flared to life. He didn't see a citizen with rights. He saw a challenge to his dominion, a chance to flex the power he wore like a second skin. "Calm down now," Daniel barked, his voice slicing through the air, heavy with the weight of command. His uniform was pristine, the badge on his chest glinting under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of his self-proclaimed invincibility. Jamal barely had time to turn before Daniel's hand shot out, seizing his arm with a grip like iron. In a flash, the young man was shoved face first against the wall, the thud of his body echoing down the hall. Gasps flickered through the crowd, but no one moved. Daniel's knee sank into Jamal's back, pinning him to the floor, while his hands wrenched the man's wrists backward with deliberate force. Jamal's cries were muffled against the marble, a choked sound of pain and disbelief, but they pierced the air nonetheless, a desperate plea that hung unanswered. Daniel didn't flinch. His lips curled into a faint smirk, a spark of satisfaction flickering in his cold blue eyes. At 38, with 15 years on the force, he carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never tasted real consequence. He'd seen colleagues walk free after worse, far worse, than this. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, outright brutality. They piled up like autumn leaves, only to be swept away by a system that shielded its own. The department didn't just tolerate him. It enabled him, brushing off his aggression as the rough edge of a tough job. Daniel reveled in it. The fear he inspired, the way people shrank under his gaze, the unspoken understanding that his word was law. This moment, with Jamal writhing beneath him, was just another notch in a belt heavy with unpunished sins. Then came a voice, clear, steady, cutting through the haze of his arrogance like a blade. "Get off him, now!" It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the air shift. Daniel didn't bother looking up at first. He was used to bystanders muttering, complaining, their words dissolving into the ether without action. But this voice didn't waver. It grew closer, accompanied by the soft click of heels against the floor. Annoyance flickered across his face as he finally tilted his head, his grip on Jamal tightening instinctively. Standing before him was a black woman, her posture unyielding, her dark eyes locked on his with an intensity that unsettled him. She was shorter than he was, her frame slight but commanding, dressed in a tailored blazer that spoke of purpose. Her expression was calm, but beneath it simmered something dangerous, a quiet fury that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Daniel spat, rising to his full height. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing the light around her, his voice dripping with venom and entitlement. "Step back before I make you." She didn't budge. The hallway seemed to shrink as he took a step closer, then another, his boots thudding against the marble like a drumbeat of intimidation. "You're using excessive force," she said, her tone unwavering, each word deliberate. "Let him go." A laugh rumbled in his chest, low and mocking. "You think you can tell me what to do?" He leaned in, his breath hot and sour, his face inches from hers. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't take orders from your kind. You people always want to cry victim, running your mouths like you own the place. But out here—" He jabbed a finger into his chest, his smirk widening. "I am the law." Her hands balled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. Inside, a storm raged. Years of swallowed indignities, of being dismissed, underestimated, reduced to nothing but the color of her skin. She'd felt this before, countless times, but today it burned hotter, fueled by the sight of Jamal's crumpled form, by the smug cruelty radiating from this man who thought himself untouchable. "You're not supposed to be here," Daniel sneered, his voice rising. "This is a courthouse, not a welfare line. Unless you're here to mop the floors, I suggest you get out before I throw you out." A murmur rippled through the onlookers now, a low hum of unease. Heads turned, eyes widened, but fear kept them rooted in place, spectators to a collision they couldn't stop. "Last chance," she said, her voice sharpening, slicing through his taunts. "Let him go." Daniel's patience snapped like a brittle twig. "You don't give me chances," he growled. In one swift, brutal motion, he seized her arm, twisting it with just enough force to sting, to assert his dominance. Gasps erupted from the crowd, the murmurs swelling into a stunned silence that pressed against the walls. He smirked again, savoring the moment, oblivious to the shift in the air. "See, that's what happens when you don't listen. Maybe next time." "Officer, let her go." The command came from behind him, firm and icy, slicing through his bravado. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with an authority that made his smirk falter. He froze, his hand still clamped around her arm, and for the first time, he felt the weight of eyes, dozens of them, boring into him. He glanced around, unease creeping up his spine. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting, their silence thick with anticipation. Something was wrong. His grip loosened, but the damage was done. In that moment, the world tilted beneath his feet, though he didn't yet know why. 5 minutes later, the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave, leaving him pale and trembling. She wasn't just a bystander. She was Judge Naomi Carter, 42, fierce, and one of the most formidable figures in the state's legal system. A woman who'd clawed her way up from the streets of Atlanta, through a world that tried to break her at every turn, to sit in judgment over men like him. Her life was a testament to resilience, forged in the fires of subtle slights and overt hatred, the overlooked promotions of her father, a proud cop, the condescension of teachers who couldn't fathom her brilliance, the daily masks her mother wore to survive. Naomi had turned every wound into a weapon, graduating at the top of her law school class, shattering glass ceilings, and earning a reputation as a judge who wielded justice with an iron hand and a compassionate heart. Daniel's mind reeled as the realization sank in. The woman he'd mocked, assaulted, dismissed as beneath him was the very authority he'd claimed to embody. The courthouse erupted into chaos as whispers turned to shouts, clerks and lawyers scrambling to process what they'd witnessed. Jamal, released from Daniel's grip, staggered to his feet, his eyes blazing with a mix of pain and vindication. Naomi stood tall, her gaze never leaving Daniel's, her silence more damning than any words. The lesson was clear, etched into the stunned faces around them. Power abused carries a price, and justice, when it comes, spares no one. For Daniel, the consequences were swift and merciless. His badge, his shield, was stripped away as internal affairs descended, unearthing a trail of complaints he'd thought buried. The system that had once protected him now turned its back, leaving him exposed, a cautionary tale whispered in precincts and courtrooms alike. For Naomi, it was another battle won, a reminder that her fight, for herself, for Jamal, for every soul crushed under the weight of arrogance, was far from over. The courthouse would never forget that day, when a racist cop's world crumbled at the hands of the judge he'd dared to defy, proving that true power lies not in force, but in the unwavering pursuit of what is right. The air in the courthouse hallway buzzed with a restless energy, thick with the hum of footsteps and murmured conversations, when Daniel's voice sliced through it all. "Calm down," he sneered, his words dripping with mockery, each syllable a taunt as if he relished the sight of the young man squirming beneath his grip. His tone wasn't just commanding, it was cruel, a deliberate twist of the knife meant to provoke. He towered over Jamal, a black man pinned to the cold, tiled floor, his knee pressing harder into Jamal's back with every defiant twitch. Daniel's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes glinting with the thrill of control, oblivious to the storm brewing just steps away. Naomi Carter had been walking toward the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her navy blue dress swaying with each measured step. It wasn't her judge's robe, not yet, just a simple, elegant garment that hugged her frame, understated yet striking. She wasn't cloaked in the trappings of her authority, not adorned with the symbols that would later command respect. In that moment, she was simply a woman, a witness to the scene unfolding before her, her heart pounding with a quiet fury she kept tightly leashed. She saw everything. The arrogance in Daniel's stance, the fear flickering in Jamal's eyes, the way the officer's hands tightened as if daring his prey to resist further. Her breath caught, not out of shock, but out of a deep, simmering resolve. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, controlled, steady, but laced with an edge that could not be ignored. "Get off of him." The words were firm, a command wrapped in calm, though beneath it burned a righteous anger she refused to let spill over. Daniel didn't even glance her way at first, his focus locked on Jamal, his grip unrelenting. "Ma'am, step back," he muttered, his tone dismissive, as if she were nothing more than a bothersome bystander. "This isn't your business." His words were a brush-off, casual and careless, reducing her to an annoyance he could swat away without a second thought. But Naomi didn't budge. She took another step closer, her presence growing larger with every inch, her voice sharpening as she pressed on. "Officer, he's not resisting. You're using excessive force." Her eyes bore into him, unwavering, daring him to acknowledge her. Finally, Daniel turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers, and in that split second, he made his gravest error. He didn't see her, not truly. He saw only her skin, her gender, a black woman standing before him, and to him, that was all she could ever be. A challenge to his dominion, a threat to the power he wielded so recklessly. Recognition didn't dawn in his eyes. Instead, a dangerous condescension flared. "Listen, lady," he said, his smirk stretching wider, his voice dipping into a tone that oozed menace and mockery. "I don't know what little social justice class you took, but out here, this is how things work. Maybe next time you'll learn to mind your own damn business." He stepped toward her, looming over her with deliberate menace, his broad frame casting a shadow meant to intimidate. His chest puffed out, his posture screaming dominance, as if he could will her into submission through sheer physicality. But Naomi stood her ground, her spine straight, her chin lifted, her resolve unyielding. "Let him go," she said again, her voice dropping to a chilling calm, each word weighted with an authority he couldn't yet comprehend. Daniel laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the walls. "You think you give me chances?" His grip tightened on Jamal, who let out a stifled groan, his face pressed harder against the floor. "See, this is the problem with you people," Daniel spat, his words venomous, his arrogance blinding him to the shifting tide around him. "Always running your mouths, always acting like you're in charge, but out here, I'm the one with the badge. I'm the one with the power." The air crackled with tension, a live wire on the verge of snapping when Daniel made his fatal move. His hand shot out, seizing Naomi's arm with a force that yanked her back, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. A sharp gasp rippled through the hallway, not from Naomi, but from the onlookers, clerks, lawyers, passers-by, who froze in their tracks. Their eyes widened, not in fear of the act itself, but in anticipation of its consequences, a truth Daniel was still too blind to grasp. The atmosphere shifted, heavy and electric, as if the very walls held their breath. Daniel's confidence faltered for a fleeting moment, a flicker of unease darting across his face, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. He didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped into a trap of his own making. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She simply stared into his eyes, her gaze steady and unflinching, a quiet storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. Around them, the crowd stirred, whispers slithering through the air, eyes darting between the officer and the woman he still held in his grasp. The weight of their attention pressed down on Daniel, though he remained oblivious, too drunk on his own authority to notice the warning signs. Then, a voice broke through the murmur, firm and unshaken. "Officer!" It came from behind him, sharp and commanding, slicing through his bravado like a guillotine. Daniel's grip loosened, just slightly, his head turning as instinct tugged at the edges of his awareness. He didn't release Naomi, not yet, but the seed of doubt had been planted. In 5 minutes his world would collapse, and when the truth of who Naomi Carter truly was crashed over him, there would be no escape. The silence that followed was suffocating, a dense fog settling over the hallway, amplifying every rustle, every breath. Daniel's fingers still clung to her arm, but that flicker of uncertainty in his eyes grew, a predator sensing the ground shift beneath its feet. Naomi's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not triumphant, not yet, but a quiet acknowledgement of the reckoning to come. "Let me go," she said, her voice a smooth, steady current, carrying the weight of inevitability. Daniel's jaw clenched, his grip tightening defiantly. "You don't tell me what to do," he growled, his pride a flimsy shield against the tide rising against him. A rustle stirred in the crowd, papers shifting, a throat clearing, and then another voice cut through, sharper this time, urgent. "Officer Hayes, Mace." It belonged to a bailiff, a middle-aged black man named Marcus, who had been watching from the sidelines, his broad shoulders tense, his dark eyes flickering with a mix of concern and warning. He stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his presence steady, a man who had seen too many scenes like this unfold and knew exactly where this one was headed. His gaze darted between Naomi and Daniel, something unreadable, anger, perhaps, or pity, flashing across his weathered face. Daniel ignored him, his focus still locked on Naomi, his ego too bloated to register the growing chorus of dissent. "You should listen to her," Marcus said, louder now, his voice a lifeline Daniel refused to grasp. The officer scoffed, shaking his head as if the suggestion were absurd. "I don't take orders from—" Naomi leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. A blade slipped between his ribs. "You have no idea what you just did." Daniel's smirk returned, that cocky, practiced grin he'd worn like armor for years. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I can promise you this. Judge Carter." The words rang out, clear and resonant, spoken by a prosecutor standing a few feet away, a woman in a sharp gray suit, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide with horror. The hallway exhaled as one, a collective release of breath, and Naomi didn't even blink. But Daniel, he froze. For one fleeting second, confusion creased his brow, a slow tide of realization creeping in. He turned his head, just enough to glimpse the source of the voice, and saw not just the prosecutor but the others, lawyers, clerks, even fellow officers, staring, whispering, piecing together the catastrophic mistake he'd made. Judge Carter. The title echoed in his mind, a hammer striking stone, and it finally clicked. His fingers slackened, his grip falling away as if her skin had burned him. Naomi stepped back, rolling her shoulder to ease the ache where his hand had been, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She didn't need to look at him. Everyone else did. The room had transformed in an instant, the power flipping like a switch. Where Daniel had once stood as an untouchable force, he was now laid bare, vulnerable, his authority stripped away by the weight of his own actions. He had assaulted a judge, not just any judge, but the judge, the one presiding over the case waiting just down the hall. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his chest tightening as panic clawed at his throat. His mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, a defense, anything to claw back the control slipping through his fingers. But there was no undoing this. Naomi turned slowly, tilting her head to meet his gaze at last. Her expression held no anger, no outrage, just a quiet, piercing disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. "Officer Hayes," she said, her tone light, almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather over coffee. "Tell me something." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice barely a rasp. "Ma'am." She gestured subtly toward Jamal, still on the ground, his body tense, his breathing uneven, his eyes darting between fear and defiance. "That young man you just put your hands on, what exactly was his crime?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no sound came. Naomi tilted her head, her voice soft but relentless. "You were so sure of yourself a moment ago, so certain you had the right to use force." "I'm curious, was it his tone, his posture, or was it simply that you didn't like seeing a black man stand his ground?" The hallway seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around Daniel, trapping him in the wreckage of his own hubris. Naomi's eyes narrowed just slightly, her words a quiet indictment. "You put your hands on me," she said, and for the first time a hint of steel gleamed beneath her calm. "And in doing so, you showed everyone here exactly what happens when power is abused." Tick. The lesson hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Justice, true justice, doesn't bend to arrogance, and the consequences of overstepping would follow him long after this moment faded. Marcus, the bailiff, shifted his weight, his arms crossed, his gaze steady on Daniel, a silent witness to the officer's fall. The prosecutor clutched her files tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line, already imagining the legal storm about to descend. Jamal pushed himself up, slowly, his hands trembling but his head held high, a spark of resilience flickering in his eyes. And Naomi, she stood at the center of it all, unshaken, her quiet strength a testament to the power Daniel had failed to see until it was too late. The courthouse hallway, once his domain, was now a stage for his reckoning, a vivid reminder that authority unchecked is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the weight of its own excess. In the shadow of the courthouse, a palpable tension hung in the air, thick and heavy like a fog rolling in off a restless sea. Daniel Hayes, once a figure of unshakable confidence, felt the ground shift beneath his boots. There was something in Naomi Carter's voice, something sharp, dangerous, coiled like a snake ready to strike, that made his chest tighten. He took an involuntary step back, his throat constricting around words he couldn't force out, his Adam's apple bobbing uselessly as panic flickered in his wide, darting eyes. The bustling hallway, filled with the low hum of voices and the shuffle of feet, seemed to close in around him. Then came another voice, softer but insistent, cutting through the haze of his spiraling thoughts. "Judge Carter, should we alert security?" It was the bailiff, a wiry man named Robinson, his brow furrowed with concern. He'd been Daniel's friend, or at least as close to one as you could get in a world built on rank and loyalty. Earlier that day, Robinson had pulled Daniel aside, his voice low and urgent, warning him that trouble was brewing, that Naomi wasn't the type to let things slide. Now, standing there with his hands clasped nervously in front of him, Robinson's eyes flicked between Daniel and the judge, searching for some sign of what would come next. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She let the question hang there, suspended in the stifling air, as if savoring the weight of it. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was deliberate, a chess move calculated to unnerve. Daniel's breathing grew ragged, shallow gasps betraying the cracks forming in the armor of his composure. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands twitched at his sides as he fought to keep the fear at bay. Finally, Naomi exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that seemed to carry the weight of a decision already made.
"No,"
she said, her voice steady, almost too calm.
"Not yet."
Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. Not yet. The words echoed in his skull, heavy with implication. They weren't a kindness, not a lifeline tossed to a drowning man. They were a promise, a dark, looming threat that whatever was coming would hit harder than he could brace for. He could feel it now, the storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon, its shadow stretching toward him. The whispers in the hallway grew louder, a chorus of murmurs from onlookers who had begun to sense the unraveling of a man they'd once seen as invincible. Their stares bore into him, sharp and unrelenting, as if they could already see the wreckage he was about to become. Naomi turned to Robinson, her movements deliberate, her authority radiating in the way she carried herself. "Get Mr. Robinson some water," she instructed, her tone clipped but not unkind, "and have a seat arranged for him in my courtroom." The bailiff nodded quickly, scurrying off to obey, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished marble floor. Then Naomi's gaze returned to Daniel, and for the first time, a faint smile curved her lips, a small, knowing thing that sent a shiver racing down his spine. "As for Officer Hayes," she added, her voice dropping lower, "we'll deal with him soon enough." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Daniel stood frozen, his heart slamming against his ribcage, the air around him buzzing with the certainty that whatever came next would shatter him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating, not from heat, but from the sheer weight of anticipation pressing down on every soul present. The room was packed, every bench occupied by a sea of faces, some curious, some accusatory, all waiting to witness justice unfold. The wooden walls, polished to a dull sheen, seemed to lean inward, trapping the tension that writhed between the rows of seats. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a low hum of speculation and judgment that coiled around Daniel as he sat in the defendant's chair, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too foreign. Less than an hour ago, he'd strode into this building with the swagger of a man untouchable, certain that whatever had happened in that hallway would blow over. He'd convinced himself that Naomi, Judge Carter, wouldn't dare make a spectacle of him, that her own reputation would keep her in check, that someone, anyone, would step in to shield him as they always had. But no one did. His superiors wouldn't meet his eyes as he'd been escorted in, their faces turned away as if he were already a ghost. His colleagues, scattered among the crowd, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their silence louder than any words. Even the prosecutors, seated across from him with their neat stacks of files, offered no hints. Just blank stares that promised nothing but clarity of purpose. For the first time in 15 years, Daniel found himself on the wrong side of the law he'd sworn to uphold. His fists clenched beneath the table, knuckles whitening as his pulse thundered in his ears. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at Naomi, though her presence loomed over the room like a storm cloud. Now draped in her judge's robe, she sat at the bench, a pillar of unyielding authority. She didn't need to speak. The very fact of this moment, him, here, exposed, said everything. The prosecutor rose, a woman with sharp features and a voice like tempered steel. "Officer Hayes," she began, her tone measured but piercing, "you are being charged with assault, abuse of power, and excessive use of force against an unarmed civilian. We are also reviewing additional civil rights violations and pending complaints previously dismissed under questionable circumstances." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He'd heard those charges before, spoken them himself even, but never aimed at him. His mouth went dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his palate as he flicked his eyes toward Naomi, half expecting her to halt this nightmare, to call it off. But she only met his gaze with a calm, unshakable resolve that told him there was no escape. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice barely audible, trembling with disbelief. He turned to his lawyer, a harried man thrust upon him at the last minute after the police union began pulling away like rats fleeing a sinking ship. "Tell them this is ridiculous. I was doing my job." The lawyer cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable as he adjusted his tie. "Officer Hayes," he began, but Daniel cut him off, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper as his hands gripped the table's edge. "No, She's making a point. This is political. You can't seriously—" "Officer Hayes!" Naomi's voice sliced through the room, not loud, not angry, but absolute. It stopped him cold. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since this began. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that suggested she'd just pieced together the last fragment of a long unsolved riddle. "You keep saying that," she said, her tone almost thoughtful, "that you were just doing your job." She paused, letting the words settle into the silence, then leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Officer Hayes, was it your job to shove an unarmed man against a wall? Was it your job to trample his rights? Was it your job to lay hands on me?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat so tight he could barely breathe. He started, but she didn't let him finish. "Because if that's the case," she pressed, her voice growing edged, "I have to wonder how many others you've treated the way you treated Mr. Robinson today. How many walked away with bruises they couldn't speak of? How many walked away at all?" The courtroom fell deathly still, the weight of her questions pressing down on every listener. Daniel's fingers curled tighter, his knuckles bone white, his mind racing for an answer, an excuse. Anything. "This is a setup," he rasped, desperation cracking his voice. "You're just trying to ruin me." Naomi exhaled softly, a faint shake of her head betraying a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, or exhaustion. "Ruin you?" She leaned closer, her eyes piercing into his. "Officer Hayes, you ruined yourself." The finality of her words landed like a stone sinking into deep water. There was no way out, no path back. The prosecutor stood again, her voice cutting through the haze. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence, including multiple eyewitness accounts, we request that Officer Hayes be suspended indefinitely pending further investigation and that his firearm and badge be revoked immediately." Daniel's entire body went rigid. "My badge?" The words slipped out, a breathless whisper, as if losing it would strip away the last tether to who he thought he was. Without it, he was nothing. Just a man, small and exposed. Naomi's response was swift, unyielding. "Request granted." The gavel struck wood with a sound that reverberated through his bones, a death knell to the life he'd known. He sat motionless, his breath hitching, as two court officers approached. "Your badge and gun, Officer Hayes," one said, his hand outstretched. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. His fingers shook as he reached for them, the badge heavy in his palm, the gun a cold, familiar weight. Reluctantly, he handed them over, and with that act, it was done. His head spun, his chest burning with a chaotic mix of rage, shame, and terror. Naomi watched him, her gaze steady, and then she spoke, her voice quiet but resonant. "This is what accountability looks like." As he was escorted out, past the crowd that once trembled at his presence, past eyes that now saw him as a fallen relic, Daniel realized the bitter truth. Justice, when it came, spared no one, not even those who'd wielded power as a weapon. The lesson seared into him: abuse that power, and the consequences would find you, relentless and unforgiving, until all that remained was the hollow echo of what you once were. Daniel Hayes trudged through the echoing corridors of the courthouse, his legs trembling beneath him as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Each breath he took came in shallow, jagged gasps, his chest tightening with every uneven thud of his heart. The reality of what had just unfolded, and what was still unraveling, pressed down on him like a suffocating shroud, clinging to his skin, inescapable and relentless. Every step he took grew heavier, slower, as if the polished marble floor were quicksand, pulling him deeper into a pit he couldn't claw his way out of. The walls of the courthouse, once a backdrop to his swaggering confidence, now loomed closer, their cold stone surfaces narrowing around him like a vice. It was as if they, too, were aware of his sins, whispering accusations with every shadow they cast. The people he passed, clerks scribbling notes, attorneys in crisp suits, officers in starched uniforms, and civilians clutching paperwork, watched him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Some murmured under their breath, their words too faint to catch but sharp enough to sting. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze, as though he carried some contagious blight. And then there were those who stared openly, their expressions alight with a quiet, vengeful glee that churned his stomach. They had waited for this moment, hadn't they? For years they'd watched him strut through these halls, untouchable, invincible, or so he'd thought. Now they reveled in his fall, their piercing looks slicing into him like blades. Rage surged through him, hot and bitter, tangling with the humiliation that burned in his throat. His jaw clenched so tightly his teeth throbbed, and his fists balled at his sides, nails carving crescent moons into his palms. They were treating him like some petty crook, a thug paraded through the courthouse in disgrace. This wasn't how his story was supposed to end. He needed to escape, to break free from the suffocating air, to gulp down something clean and untainted. But then a voice sliced through the haze, stopping him dead in his tracks. "You finally understand, don't you?" Daniel's pulse spiked as he whipped around, his breath catching in his chest. There, standing just a few feet away, was Jamal Robinson, the same man he'd slammed against a wall hours earlier, the same man he'd degraded without a flicker of remorse. Now Jamal faced him with arms crossed, his posture steady, his dark eyes glinting with a clarity that made Daniel's skin crawl. There was no smirk on Jamal's face, no trace of smug triumph, just a quiet, piercing calm, and something worse, pity. It twisted Daniel's insides into knots, a sickening wave of nausea rising in his gut. "You got lucky," Daniel growled, his voice raspy and low, the words scraping against his raw throat. He needed to claw back some shred of control to convince himself this was all a fluke. Jamal tilted his head, his lips pressing into a thin, unamused line before a short, dry laugh escaped him. A sound devoid of humor, laced instead with a weight that made Daniel's flesh prickle. "Luck?" Jamal echoed, his tone sharp as he shook his head. "You think this is about luck?" He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his gaze locking onto Daniel's with an intensity that pinned him in place. "Tell me, Officer Hayes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate murmur. "Was it luck that made you slam me against that wall? Was it luck that had your knee grinding into my spine? Or when you laid your hands on her, was that luck too?" Daniel's mouth parted, but no words came. His mind scrambled for a defense, but Jamal pressed on, relentless, his voice steady as a blade. "You didn't stop. You didn't hesitate. You didn't even think. And now you're standing here acting like you're the one who's been wronged. Like this is some tragedy that just happened to you." Daniel's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his jaw locking tight as he muttered, "You don't get it. You've never been a cop. You don't know what it's like out there." Jamal's expression didn't flicker, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. A quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. "You think I don't know what it's like?" he shot back, his voice edged with a raw, controlled fury that made Daniel's skin tingle. "You think I don't know what it feels like to have a cop's hands on me, to be shoved against a wall for no reason, to have my body treated like it's nothing?" A dark, ugly sensation stirred in Daniel's chest, clawing its way up from somewhere deep and buried. Jamal exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if to dispel the weight of his own words. "You think today was the first time someone like you tried to grind me into the dirt?" His voice dropped lower, turning cold and lethal. "The only difference is today someone finally stopped you." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from Daniel's lungs. His breathing grew uneven, his nails digging deeper into his palms as Jamal held his gaze, unflinching. "You spent your whole life thinking that badge made you a god," Jamal said, his voice softening to a near whisper. "But what do you feel like now that it's gone?" Before Daniel could muster a response, a slow, deliberate clap reverberated through the corridor, cutting through the tension like a knife. He turned, his heart lurching, and there she was, Naomi Carter, standing at the far end of the hall. Her arms were folded across her chest, her posture relaxed yet commanding, her face a mask of unreadable calm. But her eyes, those sharp, unrelenting eyes, burned with a lethality that tightened Daniel's throat. Fear crept into his fists this time, not anger, as Jamal glanced between them with a weary exhale. "I'll see you in court," he said simply, then turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the hum of the courthouse. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his chest heaving, his mind spiraling out of control. Naomi stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble with a slow, measured rhythm that echoed like a countdown. Each sound reminded him of how little power he had left. He squared his shoulders, trying to mask the terror clawing at his insides as his world crumbled in real time. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze raking over him as if she were peeling back every layer he'd ever built. "Tell me something, Officer Hayes," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate. He refused to speak, his jaw locked tight, but she tilted her head, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. "You always thought that badge made you untouchable, didn't you?" She took another step forward, her presence shrinking the space between them. "How does it feel now, knowing that without it, you're just a man with nothing to shield you?" His breath hitched, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You think this makes you better than me?" he spat, desperation seeping into his tone. Naomi exhaled, a faint shake of her head accompanying the gesture. "No," she said, her voice softening but carrying a steely edge. "But I think it forces you to see what the rest of us have always known." She leaned in closer, her words dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "Justice isn't just about laws, Daniel. It's about power. And for the first time in your miserable life, you don't have any." His heart slammed against his rib cage, dizziness washing over him because deep down he knew she was right. Later, Daniel slumped in a sterile waiting area outside the judge's chambers, his back pressed against the unforgiving wooden bench. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping out a nervous rhythm he'd never noticed before. The weight of the day had settled into his bones, heavier than he'd ever imagined possible. His badge was gone, stripped from him like a stolen crown. His gun, confiscated. His career, his very identity had dissolved in mere minutes. The courthouse buzzed around him, a chaotic symphony of footsteps and voices, but it all felt distant, muffled, as if he were submerged underwater, drowning in the wreckage of his own making. He'd spent years striding through these halls like a king, believing he was woven into the very fabric of this place. Now people passed him without a glance, no nods of respect, no fleeting exchanges, no recognition. He'd become a ghost, invisible to the world he'd once ruled. The realization twisted his stomach into knots. He'd always assumed power was eternal, a birthright that couldn't be snatched away. But now, he saw it for what it truly was, fleeting, fragile, a house of cards waiting to collapse. True power wasn't the badge or the uniform. It was control, influence, the ability to shape the story. And he had none of that left. The chamber door creaked open, and Naomi emerged, her composure unshaken, her movements graceful yet resolute. But there was a new edge to her gaze, a finality that sent a shiver racing down Daniel's spine. He'd faced snarling suspects, furious criminals who'd cursed his name, but nothing compared to the quiet, unyielding judgment in her eyes. "Follow me," she said, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. He hesitated. a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest before pushing himself to his feet. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a gavel strike. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to those who'd abused their power, and its consequences were as inevitable as they were merciless. Daniel staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him as though the ground itself had turned traitor. Each step he took behind Naomi felt like a march toward an executioner's block, his mind a chaotic storm of desperation, screaming at him to say something, anything, that might unravel the mess he'd made. But deep down, a hollow certainty gnawed at him. There was no fixing this. No words could stitch together the wreckage of his choices. They crossed the threshold into her chambers, the massive wooden door groaning shut behind them with a finality that echoed in his bones. The room stretched out before him, elegant yet suffocating, a sanctuary of order and power. Towering bookshelves lined the walls, their shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound legal tomes, each one a silent witness to the principles he'd trampled. At the center stood a grand desk, its surface pristine, papers stacked with meticulous care, everything in its rightful place, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling inside him. This was a space that demanded reverence, a throne room for justice itself, and he felt like an intruder, small and unworthy under its gaze. Naomi positioned herself near the desk, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of a nearby lamp, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, waiting, her silence a blade pressing against his resolve. Daniel cleared his throat, the sound rasping and unsteady, his voice barely holding together as it clawed its way out. "Is this where you tell me my life's over?" The words hung in the air, fragile and raw, a plea disguised as a question. Naomi exhaled, a slow, measured breath, shaking her head as though his fear exhausted her. "Your life isn't over, Daniel," she said, her tone steady but edged with something colder. "But the life you thought you were entitled to? That's gone. Vanished. You don't get to cling to it anymore." His fingers twitched at his sides, a nervous tick he couldn't suppress, the first stirrings of defiance flickering in his chest. "You think I deserve this?" he shot back, his voice cracking under the strain. Her eyes narrowed, just a fraction, but enough to sharpen the air between them. "Did you ever stop to think," she countered, her words deliberate, piercing, "that the people you laid your hands on deserved what you did to them?" His jaw locked tight, teeth grinding as a flood of memories surged up, flashes of faces, shouts, the weight of his badge justifying every shove, every bruise. "I wasn't," he started, but Naomi cut him off, stepping closer, her presence looming larger than the room itself. "You weren't what, Daniel?" Her voice was ice now, honed to a razor's edge. "You weren't brutal? You weren't unfair? You weren't abusing the authority you swore to uphold?" His throat constricted, a vice squeezing the air from his lungs because he knew what came next. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "I've seen the reports, Daniel," she said, her tone unwavering, laced with a disgust that made his stomach churn. "I've read the complaints, dozens of them, buried before they could even breathe, dismissed before anyone dared listen. Your name shows up again and again, like a stain that won't wash out. People who said you mistreated them, humiliated them, used your power to bend them to your will, to make them fear you." He shook his head, a reflex more than a defense, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You don't know what it's like out there, Naomi. You don't get it." She scoffed, a sharp, bitter sound, crossing her arms as her gaze bore into him. "No, I don't know what it's like to walk into a room and have everyone assume I belong there. I don't know what it's like to have my authority handed to me on a silver platter, unquestioned, unchallenged. You think I haven't fought tooth and nail against a system rigged to doubt me? To diminish me? Every time I step into a space like this, I have to prove I deserve it. My credentials, my competence, my very existence. And you waltzed into every room like it was your birthright. And when someone dared to defy you, you crushed them to prove a point." Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away the armor he'd worn for years. Daniel's hands balled into fists, knuckles whitening, his pulse hammering in his ears. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, the excuse sounding flimsy even to himself. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with something fiercer than anger. Disappointment, maybe, or pity. "Your job was to serve and protect, Daniel. Tell me, who were you protecting when you slammed Jamal Robinson against that wall? When you left him bruised and trembling, just because you could?" His chest burned, a searing heat spreading through him, but no answer came. "Who were you protecting when you grabbed me?" she pressed, her voice dropping lower, heavy with the weight of betrayal. "You weren't doing your job, Daniel. You were doing what you've always done, wielding your power like a weapon to keep people in line, to make them afraid of you." He exhaled slowly, the breath shuddering out of him as he stared at the polished floor, unable to meet her gaze. A strange, suffocating feeling coiled in his chest, unfamiliar, invasive, unbearable. Shame. It was shame, sinking its claws into him, and he didn't know how to fight it. Naomi watched him, her silence stretching out like a judge weighing a verdict. When she spoke again, her tone softened, but it carried a gravity that shook him. "You have a choice, Daniel." His head jerked up, confusion clouding his eyes. "What?" She leaned against the desk, arms still crossed, her posture relaxed yet unyielding. "You think this is the worst of it? Losing your badge, your title? This is just the beginning. There are civil suits piling up against you, cases being reopened, witnesses coming forward. The media's already circling, ready to plaster your name across every headline. Soon, Daniel won't just be a name. It'll be a synonym for corruption, for everything wrong with the system. You think this is bad? Wait until the whole country sees you for what you are." His breath hitched, caught somewhere between panic and disbelief, the walls of the room seeming to close in tighter. "You can fight it," she went on, tilting her head slightly, her voice calm but unrelenting. "You can scream that you're the victim, that the system's turned on you, that it's all unfair. You can deny every accusation, cling to your pride, and watch it all crumble anyway. We both know how that ends. You'll lose everything." His jaw tightened, muscles twitching as he braced himself. "Or," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, dangerous and deliberate, "you can do something you've never done before. Take responsibility." His stomach twisted, a sickening lurch that made him feel unsteady even sitting down. "Admit it," Naomi urged, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "Admit what you did. Apologize to the people you hurt. Jamal, me, all of them. Try to undo even a fraction of the damage you've caused. It won't erase the past, but it's better than being remembered as just another crooked cop who never learned his lesson." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat raw, his body rigid as if every muscle had turned to stone. For years, he'd lived with an unshakable belief. He was untouchable. No matter how far he pushed, how many lines he crossed, the badge had been his shield, his invincibility. He'd walked away from every incident unscathed, head high, conscience quiet. But that illusion was gone now, shattered into pieces at his feet, and for the first time he faced a crossroads he'd never imagined. Run from the truth or confront it head on. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, forcing him to reckon with the man he'd become. His hands rested on his knees, clenched tight, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his chest. He wanted to lash out, to shout that this was unjust, that he'd been targeted, betrayed. But the words wouldn't come. They couldn't. Because beneath the anger, beneath the fear, a quiet voice whispered the truth he'd spent years drowning out. Across from him, Naomi sat composed, her presence a quiet storm of authority that needed no force to command. She didn't yell, didn't threaten, just sat there, letting the weight of his actions settle over him like a shroud. "You think if I'd just admit it, Everything will be okay, he rasped, the words scraping against his throat, each syllable a struggle. She tilted her head, studying him with a gaze that saw too much.
No,
she said simply, but it's the only way you leave this with even a shred of dignity left. A bitter laugh escaped him, short and hollow, devoid of humor. Just exhaustion, just surrender. Dignity? You think I have any of that left? Naomi's exhale was slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. That depends. Are you going to sit there and tell me you don't regret a damn thing? His mouth opened, then closed, his fingers twitching against his knees as the silence stretched taut between them. Because the truth, the ugly, jagged truth, was that he did regret it. He regretted the moment he'd pinned Jamal Robinson to that wall, the rush of power flooding his veins as the younger man's defiance crumbled. He regretted the way he'd grabbed Naomi, dismissing her as insignificant, another obstacle to bulldoze. He regretted the arrogance that had blinded him, the certainty that no one would ever hold him accountable. And now, sitting here, stripped bare under her unflinching stare, he regretted it all. I never thought it'd come to this, he murmured, his voice so quiet it barely reached her. Naomi nodded, just slightly, leaning back in her chair, her hands clasped as she regarded him. And that's exactly why it did. The words hit him like a sledgehammer, cracking open the fragile shell he'd built around himself. I thought I was just doing my job, he said again, but the excuse rang hollow, a tired echo of a lie he could no longer believe. Naomi arched an eyebrow, her expression unyielding. Your job wasn't to hurt people, Daniel, but somewhere along the way you convinced yourself it was. His jaw clenched, a last flicker of resistance, but her voice cut through it like a blade. Wasn't it? He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face, the rough scrape of his palm against stubble grounding him in the moment. He wanted to argue, to insist he'd had no choice, that the streets were a battlefield, that control was survival. But the faces of those he'd wronged loomed in his mind, their voices louder now than ever before. And he knew Naomi was right. Justice had caught up with him, not with fanfare or fury, but with the quiet, unrelenting weight of consequence. And in that moment, Daniel understood. Power abused doesn't just destroy its victims. It erodes the soul of the one who wields it, leaving nothing but regret in its wake. The air in Naomi's office hung heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of a life unraveling. Daniel sat there, his broad shoulders hunched as if the world itself were pressing down on them, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles blanched white, his nails dug into his palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks that stung faintly, a physical echo of the chaos swirling inside him. He'd spent years convincing himself he was the good guy, the one who kept the streets safe, who held the line when no one else would. But now, stripped bare of that illusion, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. Had it all been about power? Had he twisted himself into the very monster he'd once sworn to fight? The question gnawed at him, relentless, as his breath hitched unevenly in his chest. Naomi stood across from him, her arms crossed loosely, her dark eyes steady and unflinching. She sighed, a sound that carried both weariness and resolve, and shook her head slowly. That's the thing, Daniel, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade tempered by patience. They always say that after it's too late. I didn't mean for it to happen. But it doesn't change the wreckage left behind. Her words weren't cruel, but they landed hard, each one a stone dropped into the pit of his stomach. He felt it twist painfully, a knot of guilt and dread tightening until he could hardly breathe. She wasn't wrong. He'd heard it himself 100 times from the people he'd arrested, the ones he'd judged without a second thought. And now here he was, echoing the same hollow excuse. You've got a long road ahead, she continued, her tone firm, yet laced with a quiet humanity that made it impossible to tune her out. There are people out there, good people, broken people, who will never forgive you. They'll want you to pay in ways you can't even fathom yet. Lawsuits piling up, old cases being dragged back into the light, the media circling like vultures ready to tear your name apart. Your badge? That was just the start. Soon, you'll be a synonym for corruption, a cautionary tale whispered over coffee cups and courtroom benches, and you're going to have to live with that weight every single day. Her words painted a vivid, suffocating picture, and Daniel's gaze dropped to the floor, his throat so tight it burned. His body felt like a coiled spring, trembling with the tension of a man teetering on the edge of collapse. He forced himself to look up, his voice scraping out raw and jagged. "And you? What about you?" The question hung there, fragile and desperate, his eyes searching hers for some hint of mercy, or maybe vengeance. "You could ruin me, Naomi. You could make sure I never work again, never climb out of this hole. You could—" His voice faltered, dropping to a near whisper, heavy with the uncertainty of a man who'd just realized how much power he'd handed over. Naomi exhaled sharply, a quick, decisive sound, and shook her head again, her expression unyielding but not cold. "That's where we're different, Daniel," she said, her voice steady as granite. "I don't wield power just because I can. I don't twist it to crush people under my heel. I believe in justice, not revenge. But don't you dare mistake that for weakness or mercy. You will be held accountable. The only question is whether you're ready to face it." Her words sliced through him, clean and precise, leaving no room for denial. His breath came shallow, his chest tightening as if an invisible hand were squeezing his ribs. Justice. The word echoed in his mind, a concept he'd once thought he embodied, now turned against him like a mirror reflecting every flaw he'd ignored. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, raw. "You think this is the worst of it?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less piercing. "This is just the opening act. Civil suits are stacking up, families you've hurt, lives you've upended, all coming for their pound of flesh. Cases you buried are being unearthed, dusted off, and dissected. The news vans are already parked outside, cameras rolling, headlines screaming your name. Losing your badge was a pinprick compared to what's coming. Wait until the whole country sees you, not the cop, not the hero, but the man behind the mask." Her words painted a future so vivid he could almost hear the clamor of the crowd, feel the glare of the spotlight burning into his skin. His chest constricted further, his pulse pounding in his ears like a war drum. "You can fight it," she went on, her tone softening but still edged with steel. "You can scream that you're the victim, that the system's turned on you, that it's all unfair. You can cling to your excuses and your pride, but we both know where that road ends. You'll lose everything. Your name, your legacy, whatever shred of respect you've got left." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, dangerous in its calm. "Or you could do something radical, something you've never done before. Take responsibility." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow, his pulse thundering in his temples. "Admit it," she pressed, her words heavy with authority, forcing him to confront the reflection he'd avoided for so long. "Admit what you did. Apologize to the people you've crushed under your boot. Just try to mend even a fraction of the damage. It won't erase the past, but it's a hell of a lot better than rotting away as just another crooked cop who never learned his lesson." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat aching as if he'd been screaming for hours. His hands trembled faintly, the tremor of a man whose world had shattered in a single, brutal instant. For years, he'd clung to the belief that he was untouchable, that his badge was a shield, his authority a fortress. He'd told himself every hard call, every bruised suspect, every shortcut was justified by the greater good. The system, he'd thought, would always have his back. But now, sitting in this sterile office under Naomi's unwavering gaze, he saw the truth. The system had never been his ally. It had propped him up only as long as he served its image, and the moment he faltered, it cast him aside like a broken tool. His breath came uneven, ragged, his thoughts a tangled mess of regret and disbelief. Everything he'd built, his career, his identity, had crumbled in a day. leaving him exposed and small. Across the room, Naomi watched him in silence, her presence a steady anchor amid his storm. She didn't push, didn't prod, just let the reality settle over him like a suffocating fog. That quiet was worse than any accusation she could have hurled. It forced him to sit with himself, to feel the heat prickling behind his eyes, the shame clawing at his gut like a living thing. He dragged a hand over his face, the roughness of his stubble scraping against his palm, and exhaled sharply. "You think if I just admit it, everything's gonna be okay?" His voice came out raw, strained, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Naomi tilted her head again, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "No," she said simply, "but it's the only way you walk out of this with even a scrap of dignity intact." Daniel let out a laugh, sharp and humorless, the sound bouncing off the walls like a ricochet. "Dignity," he muttered, his voice cracking at the edges. "That's rich. You think I've got any of that left?" His eyes flicked up to meet hers, searching for judgment, but found only a steady, unflinching calm. She exhaled slowly, her gaze never wavering. "That depends," she said. "Are you about to sit there and tell me you don't regret a damn thing?" The question hung there, heavy and inescapable, and Daniel opened his mouth to answer, only to find nothing came out. The truth lodged in his throat, a jagged lump he couldn't swallow or spit out. Because he did regret it. All of it. He saw Jamal Robinson's face, the kid he'd pinned to the pavement without a second thought, treating him like a statistic instead of a person. He remembered the way he'd grabbed Naomi that day, his hand closing around her arm with an arrogance he hadn't even questioned, assuming she was just another obstacle to bulldoze. He could still hear the smug edge in his own voice, the certainty that he'd walk away unscathed because he always had. And now, the weight of every choice, every smirk, every abuse of power crashed down on him like a tidal wave. His voice, when it finally emerged, was barely a whisper, fragile and broken. "I never thought it'd come to this." Naomi nodded faintly, her fingers interlocking as she studied him with a mix of pity and resolve. "And that," she said, her words striking him like a fist to the chest, "is exactly why it did." He wanted to argue, to insist it wasn't that simple. The job was brutal, the decision split-second, the pressure unrelenting. He'd been out there in the chaos, trying to keep order while everyone else sat safe behind their desks. But the excuses dissolved before he could voice them, crumbling under the stark clarity of Naomi's gaze. His fingers curled tighter, nails biting deeper into his skin, and he muttered, "I thought I was just doing my job." The words sounded feeble even to him, a flimsy shield against the truth. Naomi raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but cutting. "Your job wasn't to hurt people, Daniel, but somewhere along the line you convinced yourself it was." His jaw locked, his shoulders tensing as if he could physically fend off her words. He wanted to shout that she didn't understand, that the streets weren't black and white, that he'd had to make impossible calls. But deep down he knew she was right. He'd crossed a line, again and again, until the line didn't exist anymore. And now there was no running from the consequences. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as the reality of his fall sank deeper. Outside, he could imagine the city buzzing, reporters scribbling notes, lawyers sharpening their arguments, families whispering his name with venom. Naomi's office, with its stark fluorescent lights and worn furniture, felt like the last quiet moment before the storm swallowed him whole. And yet in her steady presence, there was a lesson he couldn't ignore. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning. He'd abused his power, wielded it like a club instead of a shield, and now it was gone, leaving him to face the fallout alone. For the first time, Daniel understood that the true cost of his actions wasn't just the badge he'd lost. It was the man he'd become, and the man he'd have to confront every day in the mirror from now on. In the dim glow of the courtroom lights, Naomi's voice cut through the heavy air like a blade honed by years of resolve. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her tone steady, unyielding, a quiet storm brewing beneath her words. "But don't you dare confuse it with mercy either. You will face the consequences of your actions. It's only a matter of whether you're brave enough to own up to them." Her dark eyes locked on to Daniel's, piercing through the armor of denial he'd worn for so long. She tilted her head just slightly, a gesture so subtle yet loaded with intent, as if she could see straight into the rotting core of his soul. Daniel's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his chest tightening as though the walls themselves were closing in. He sat there, rigid in his wooden chair, his hands trembling faintly at his sides. "You think this is the worst it's going to get?" Naomi continued, her voice now a low simmer, each word deliberate, dripping with the weight of inevitability. "This is merely the opening act. There are civil suits stacking up against you like firewood waiting for a match. Cases long buried are being dragged back into the light. The media is already sinking its teeth into your story. Your name's about to become a synonym for corruption, whispered in disgust from coast to coast. Losing your badge? That was just the first crack in the dam. Wait until the flood comes, when every stranger on the street knows exactly who you are, what you really are." His pulse roared in his ears, a frantic drumbeat he couldn't silence. Naomi leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, sharp and cold as a winter wind. "You can fight it, Daniel. You can thrash and claw, paint yourself as the victim, scream that the system's turned its back on you. You can tell yourself whatever lies help you sleep at night. But we both know how that story ends. You'll lose, utterly, completely, and deservedly." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut for a fleeting second, desperate for a reprieve, but the truth was a relentless shadow he couldn't outrun. Naomi's presence loomed larger now, her composure unshaken, her words a mirror he could no longer avoid. "Or," she said, her tone softening just enough to feel like a trap, a velvet glove hiding a steel fist, "you could try something new, something you've never had the guts to do before. Take responsibility." The word landed like a stone tossed into still water, rippling through the air between them. "Admit what you've done," she pressed, her voice growing heavier, more insistent, forcing him to confront the man he'd become. "Say it out loud. Apologize to the people you've crushed under your boot. Do something, anything, to mend even a fraction of the wreckage you've left behind. It won't erase the past, but it might keep you from being remembered as just another crooked cop who never learned a damn thing." Daniel's throat burned as he swallowed, the ache spreading down to his chest. His hands, once steady enough to wield power without hesitation, now shook like leaves in a storm. For years, he'd seen himself as a guardian, a man standing firm against chaos, holding the line no matter the cost. He'd convinced himself that the badge gave him license to bend the rules, that the system would always shield him from the fallout. But now, that same system had cast him out, and the bitter realization sank in. It had never truly been his ally. His breath hitched, uneven and jagged, as his mind spiraled through a tangle of regrets and shattered illusions. In a single devastating day, the world he'd built had crumbled to ash, leaving him with a choice he'd never imagined facing: flee from the truth or stand and meet it head-on. Eat it. The courtroom was a suffocating cage of polished wood and hushed whispers. Daniel sat stiffly, his shoulders squared, his breathing slow and measured, a fragile mask of control. Inside, though, he was coming apart, thread by thread, unraveling under the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Beyond those walls, the world had already passed its verdict. His name was a stain smeared across every news channel, dissected in heated debates, ripped to shreds on social media until it was unrecognizable. His face stared back at him from articles detailing every complaint ever lodged against him, every outburst of unchecked rage, every abuse of power swept under the rug for decades. Those sins, once buried, now clawed their way to the surface, and there was no hiding from them anymore. This wasn't just another headline to shrug off. This was real, raw, and inescapable. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't the one looming over someone else, arms crossed, watching judgment fall. He was the one in the dock, exposed not just to the law, but to the silent fury of everyone he'd ever wronged. The weight of that reality settled into his chest like a boulder, crushing the air from his lungs, suffocating him with its permanence. Naomi sat at the judge's bench, her posture as steady as a statue carved from marble, her expression a blank slate. But Daniel saw her differently now. She wasn't just a figure in a robe. She was a woman who'd spent her life waging war against the injustices he'd ignored, a living testament to the justice he'd mocked with every swing of his authority. The fight had drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell. The prosecutor rose, his voice a steady cadence as he laid out the charges, each one a nail in the coffin of Daniel's old life. The room hung heavy with silence, thick with anticipation. In the gallery, faces told a dozen stories. Some crossed their arms, skeptical of the spectacle. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, drinking in every word. A few glared at Daniel with open contempt, their stares like daggers. And then there was Jamal Robinson, seated in the front row, his broad shoulders squared, his expression a storm of emotions too complex to name, pain, defiance, and something deeper that made Daniel shrink inside himself. When his turn came to speak, Daniel stood, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles blanched white. The wood beneath his fingers felt like the only anchor in a world spinning out of control. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but when he spoke, his voice held steady. "I was wrong," he said, and the room seemed to shift, a ripple of surprise passing through the crowd. "I spent years convincing myself that my badge gave me the right to do what I did. I told myself I was keeping order, protecting the streets, doing the dirty work no one else would. But that was a lie." A murmur stirred among the onlookers, soft but electric. He pressed on, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. "I abused my power. I hid behind my position, let it shield me from the consequences, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I let my own twisted biases decide who got mercy and who got punishment, and I never once stopped to question it. Why would I? No one ever made me. The system let me believe I was untouchable." His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. He forced himself to meet Jamal's gaze, the man's eyes steady and unyielding. "You deserved better," Daniel said, his voice cracking just slightly. "I can't take back what I did to you, what I did to so many others. I can't erase the pain I caused, the lives I scarred. But I can say this: I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed was deafening, a void where his defenses once stood. For the first time, he wasn't speaking to dodge blame or weave excuses. He was speaking because the lies he'd lived by had finally crumbled to dust. The judge's ruling came swift and merciless. Daniel's right to ever wear a badge again was stripped away forever. His pension vanished in an instant, and a line of civil suits loomed on the horizon, ready to pick apart what little he had left. He'd never hold power again, not over a precinct, not over a single soul. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the whispers of the crowd trailed him like a shadow, their eyes boring into his back. Yet amidst the shame and the ruin, a strange sensation flickered in his chest. Freedom, fragile and unfamiliar, born from the ashes of the man he'd been. Naomi watched him go, her face still an enigma. This had never been about settling a score. It was about justice, pure and unyielding. She'd dedicated her life to moments like this, where the system that had failed so many finally bared its teeth. Jamal emerged from the courthouse, his head held high, his steps firm against the stone steps. He wasn't naive enough to think one case could mend a fractured world, or that one man's fall could erase decades of pain. But today, a man who'd once strutted through life untouchable had been dragged into the light and made to answer. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, a rare, precious spark in a sea of shadows. Daniel's life didn't end that day, but it was forever altered. The years that followed were a slow, grueling march through the wreckage he'd left behind. He grappled with the scope of his damage, faced consequences he'd never dreamed of enduring. Some would never forgive him, their wounds too deep, their trust too shattered, and he didn't blame them. He didn't expect absolution, but he didn't run, and that choice, small as it was, became his lifeline. Across town, the small diner on the corner of Westbrook Avenue and Maple Street in Greensboro, North Carolina, hummed with its usual rhythm. Its checkered floors bore the scuffs of countless footsteps. Its faded menus carried the charm of simpler days, and the sizzle of bacon on the grill filled the air with a comforting familiarity. It was a place where secrets were traded over coffee, where the regulars thought they knew everyone's story, or at least pretended to. The bell above the glass door jingled as Anthony Hayes stepped inside, his navy blue suit crisp against the diner's worn backdrop, his gray tie catching the morning light. His polished shoes tapped lightly on the tile as he approached the counter, a confident smile tugging at his lips. "Morning," he said warmly to the waitress, who glanced up with a flicker of recognition. To her, he was just another face in the crowd. But Anthony carried a quiet certainty that turned heads, a man who knew more than he let on, watching a world that was only beginning to see itself clearly. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Anthony settled into a worn vinyl booth at the roadside diner. "I'll have a coffee and the breakfast special, eggs over easy, please," he said with a polite nod to Sharon, the waitress. She was a woman in her late 40s, her auburn hair streaked with silver and pulled into a loose bun. Her warm smile crinkled the corners of her eyes as she scribbled his order on a notepad, her pen moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd worked these tables for years. "Coming right up, hun," she replied, her voice carrying a comforting lilt. "You new around here?" Anthony let out a soft chuckle, the sound barely audible over the hum of the diner. "Not exactly. Just passing through for work. Thought I'd grab something to eat before the day gets rolling." His tone was casual, but there was a weight behind his words, a quiet weariness that hinted at long hours and longer roads. As Sharon turned toward the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the tiled floor, Anthony pulled out his phone. His fingers moved deftly across the screen, scrolling through a flood of emails, updates from colleagues, requests from superiors, the usual grind. He barely registered the diner's low chatter, the clink of dishes, or the faint country tune drifting from an old jukebox in the corner. But then, a ripple of unease cut through the room. At a booth tucked near the back, 3 men, locals by the look of their faded flannel shirts and weathered hands, exchanged loaded glances. One of them, a wiry fellow with a threadbare baseball cap pulled low over his brow, leaned in closer to his companions. His name was Earl, a man whose days were spent tinkering with engines and whose nights were filled with too many beers at the bar down the road. "Doesn't look like he belongs here, does he?" Earl muttered, his voice a gravelly whisper that carried farther than he intended. His sharp blue eyes flicked toward Anthony, sizing him up with a mix of curiosity and distrust. "Yeah," chimed in the second man, a burly figure named Tom, his thick fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. "Saw him out by that black car earlier, all shiny and fancy. Looked like he was up to something." Tom's tone dripped with suspicion, his broad shoulders tensing as if he were ready to leap into action. The third man, quieter but no less wary, was Ray, a lanky, soft-spoken mechanic with grease stains permanently etched into his knuckles. He nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Bet he's probably right. Something's off." Their words floated across the diner like a cold breeze, brushing against Anthony's ears. He heard them. He couldn't not hear them. But he chose to let it slide. Years of navigating tense situations had taught him the art of selective deafness, the wisdom of knowing when to push back and when to keep his peace. His face remained a mask of calm, though a flicker of irritation danced in his dark brown eyes. He took a deep breath, forcing his focus back to the glowing screen in his hands, determined not to let their small-minded whispers ruin his meal. When Sharon returned, balancing a steaming mug of coffee on her tray, the murmurs had swelled into a low buzz. "Here you go, hun," she said, setting the cup down with a gentle clatter. Anthony murmured a quiet, "Thanks," and lifted the mug to his lips, savoring the bitter warmth as it slid down his throat. He wanted to enjoy this fleeting moment of stillness, but the air in the diner had thickened with hostility. Glancing up, he caught Earl pulling out his phone, his weathered face tightening with purpose. "Yeah, I'd like to report something suspicious," Earl said into the receiver, his voice hushed but firm, his gaze locked on Anthony like a hunter tracking prey. Anthony exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down with deliberate care. He didn't need to hear the rest to know where this was headed. It was a tired, predictable script, one he'd lived through too many times before. Outside, the late morning sun stretched long shadows across the gravel lot, where his sleek black sedan gleamed like a polished jewel among the rusted pickups and dented compacts. To Anthony, it was just a car, a reliable tool for a man always on the move. But to the locals, it was an anomaly, a shiny intruder that didn't fit their dusty, familiar world. That alone was enough to ignite their suspicions, to make them see threat where there was none. Inside, Earl was still on the phone, his words clipped and purposeful. "Yeah, he's been hanging around acting strange, wearing a suit, but doesn't really fit in here. Could be scoping out cars or something." He cast another glance at Anthony, his voice dropping lower. "Black guy, mid-30s, I'd say. Driving a fancy car. You might want to send someone over." The dispatcher's response was brief, professional. A unit was en route. Earl hung up, a smug glint in his eye as he leaned back in the booth, satisfied with his self-appointed role as guardian of the town's peace. Meanwhile, Sharon returned with Anthony's plate, a golden heap of scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, and buttered toast, all perfectly arranged. "Enjoy, hun," she said, her smile as warm as ever, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. "Thanks, Sharon," Anthony replied, picking up his fork. His appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing frustration, but he stabbed at the eggs anyway. Leaving now would only fan the flames of their paranoia, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. The diner fell silent moments later as the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of a police cruiser. Through the smudged window, Anthony watched it roll to a stop behind his sedan, its red and blue lights glinting faintly in the sunlight. His jaw tightened, a subtle shift that betrayed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. The door swung open with a jingle and Officer James Taylor stepped inside. He was a stocky man in his early 40s, his uniform crisp and his face carved with the stern lines of a decade on the force. His boots thudded against the floor as he scanned the room, his gaze zeroing in on Anthony with laser precision. The air grew heavy, charged with anticipation. The other patrons, Earl, Tom, Ray, and a handful of wide-eyed regulars, watched with bated breath, their faces a gallery of curiosity and judgment. "Sir," Taylor said, his voice sharp and authoritative, "can you step outside with me for a moment?" Anthony set his fork down slowly, turning to face the officer. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone steady but edged with a quiet challenge. "I'll explain outside," Taylor replied, his words clipped. "Let's go." The diner was a tomb as Anthony rose, his movements deliberate, almost graceful. He reached for his wallet, but Taylor's hand shot up. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice booming now. Anthony's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring within them, but he complied, raising his hand slowly. "All right," he said evenly. "Let's go." As they stepped into the blinding sunlight, the whispers erupted again. Phones emerged from pockets, their lenses trained on the unfolding scene like eager spectators at a circus. Sharon lingered behind the counter, her hands gripping a dish rag, her brow furrowed with worry and confusion. She'd served Anthony with kindness, and now she watched helplessly as he was marched outside, her heart sinking at the injustice unfolding before her. Outside, Taylor's demeanor hardened further. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," he said, nodding toward Anthony's car. "Mind telling me what you were doing out here?" Anthony stood tall, the sun glinting off his polished shoes. "I parked my car and came in for breakfast," he replied, his voice smooth as glass, hiding the irritation simmering beneath. Taylor crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You got any ID on you?" "Yes," Anthony said. "It's in my wallet." Before he could move, Taylor snapped, "Don't move," and reached for his handcuffs. In a swift motion, he spun Anthony around, wrenching his arms behind his back. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Anthony said, his calm fraying slightly. "I've told you exactly why I'm here." Taylor ignored him, the cold steel of the cuffs clicking into place. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. From inside, the crowd pressed against the windows, their phones capturing every second. Anthony stood resolute, his expression unyielding as Taylor gripped his elbow and steered him toward the cruiser. The sun beat down, reflecting off the sedan's glossy surface, a silent witness to the absurdity of it all. A few passers-by paused on the sidewalk, their faces a mix of shock and intrigue. Anthony's composure never wavered, though inside, a quiet rage churned, rage at the predictability of it, the exhaustion of being judged by the color of his skin and the cut of his suit. "Officer," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I've asked you to check my ID. It's in my wallet, in my jacket. That should clear this up." Taylor scoffed, shaking his head. "We've heard that before. People like you always have a story. We'll handle this at the station." Anthony's jaw clenched at the barb, but he swallowed his retort. Restraint was his armor, forged through years of facing down ignorance and power unchecked. Just as Taylor opened the cruiser's door, another vehicle screeched into the lot. A second police car. Out stepped Officer Daniels, a younger man with a boyish face and wide, uncertain eyes. He took in the scene, Taylor's grip on Anthony, the cuffs glinting in the sun, and froze. "Taylor," Daniels called, striding over. "What's going on here?" "Got a call about a suspicious guy hanging around," Taylor said, jerking his head toward Anthony. "Found him in the diner. Says the car's his, but we'll confirm that at the station." Daniels stopped mid-step, his gaze locking on Anthony. Recognition dawned, and his mouth fell open. "Wait, is this a joke?" he stammered, his voice rising. "Taylor, do you know who this is?" Taylor frowned, irritation creasing his brow. "What are you talking about?" Daniels hurried closer, lowering his voice but speaking with fierce urgency. "That's Special Agent Hayes, FBI. He's one of the lead agents in this district. You've got the wrong guy." Taylor's face went slack, confusion morphing into dread. "What?" he hissed. "Yes," Daniels snapped. "Check his ID if you don't believe me." Anthony, still cuffed, turned slightly toward Taylor. "I asked you to do that earlier," he said, his tone even but laced with quiet reproach. "This could have been avoided." Taylor hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached into Anthony's jacket pocket. He pulled out the wallet, flipped it open, and stared at the badge, gleaming gold, emblazoned with the unmistakable seal of the FBI. His face drained of color, his bravado crumbling as he looked from the credentials to Anthony, then back to Daniels. The crowd at the window grew louder, their murmurs a chaotic hum. Phones still rolled, capturing Taylor's faltering expression, the cuffs on Anthony's wrists, the undeniable proof of a mistake born from prejudice and unchecked authority. Inside, Sharon's hands shook as she clutched the counter, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and anger. Earl, Tom, and Ray exchanged uneasy glances, their certainty unraveling. Outside, Daniels stepped forward, his voice firm. "Uncuff him, Taylor, now!" As the cuffs fell away, Anthony rubbed his wrists, his gaze steady and piercing. Taylor stammered, searching for words that wouldn't come. The lesson hung heavy in the air. Justice, when twisted by snap judgments and abused power, cuts deeper than any blade. For Anthony, it was another scar on a soul already weathered by such moments, but also a quiet triumph, a reminder that truth, however delayed, could still prevail. The distant hum of voices and murmurs reached their ears even before they stepped out of the car, a low rumble that seemed to ripple across the gravel-strewn parking lot of the small North Carolina diner. Taylor, his uniform crisp, but his posture stiff with unease, cast a quick glance toward the growing cluster of onlookers near the diner's entrance. Their whispers carried on the thick, humid air, tinged with curiosity and judgment. Then his gaze darted back to Anthony, whose face burned a deep, ruddy red, not from the heat, but from the sting of humiliation that pulsed beneath his calm exterior. Still bound by the cold bite of handcuffs, Anthony stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes glinting with a quiet fire. "I think it's time you take these off," he said, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade, steady, deliberate, and edged with a sharpness that demanded attention. Daniel, a younger officer with a softer face and a nervous energy, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, fumbling slightly as he pulled a small silver key from his pocket. The faint metallic clink of the cuffs unlocking punctuated the heavy silence. "I'm sorry, Agent Hayes," Daniel said, his tone thick with regret, his brows knitting together as if he could somehow undo the moment with the sincerity of his words. "This never should have happened. I mean it." Anthony flexed his wrists, the faint red marks left by the steel a silent testament to the ordeal. His expression remained a mask, unreadable yet brimming with something unspoken as he turned his gaze to Taylor. "No," he said at last, his voice low and weighted. "It shouldn't have." The words lingered, heavy as the muggy air pressing down on them, sinking into Taylor's bones. The officer stood frozen, his breath shallow, his usually confident demeanor crumbling under the quiet force of Anthony's stare. The parking lot felt like a stage now, the gravel crunching underfoot as the scene unfolded, each sound amplified by the stillness that followed Anthony's release. The cuffs were gone, but the weight of the moment clung to him like a second skin. His composure never wavered, yet the frustration simmering in his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. Years of restraint, of navigating moments just like this, flickering in those dark depths. Taylor, meanwhile, couldn't meet that gaze. His rigid stance, a wall of muscle and authority, began to crack, his shoulders hunching slightly as guilt and shame churned within him. He shifted his weight, the scuff of his boots against the ground a feeble attempt to steady himself, but his hands twitched at his sides, restless and uncertain. Beyond them, the diner's windows framed a gallery of faces. Patrons pressed close to the glass, their breakfasts forgotten, their murmurs a faint buzz that spilled into the lot. Some had ventured outside, phones clutched tightly in their hands, capturing every second of what had spiraled far beyond a simple misunderstanding. This was no longer just a fleeting incident. It was a reckoning, raw and undeniable, unfolding under the watchful eyes of a crowd that could no longer look away. Anthony turned to Daniel, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, his earnestness shining through the flush of his cheeks. "Thank you for stepping in," Anthony said, his voice softening but retaining its clarity. "You handled this the way it should have been from the start." Daniel nodded, a quick, jerky motion, his eyes dropping briefly before meeting Anthony's again. "Agent Hayes, I'm truly sorry," he said, his words stumbling over themselves. "I'll make sure this gets reported, fully." "It shouldn't have gone this far." Anthony's gaze slid back to Taylor, steady and unrelenting. "No, it shouldn't have," he repeated, the edge in his tone cutting deeper this time. "But here we are." Taylor swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he tried to find his voice. "Look, I made a mistake," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush, clumsy and raw. "I didn't know." But Anthony raised a hand, his expression sharpening, though his voice remained even. "You didn't care to know, Officer Taylor. That's the problem." He gestured toward the diner, a sweeping motion that encompassed the onlookers, the flickering neon sign, the very air thick with tension. "You assumed, without asking a single question. I gave you every chance to check my ID, to listen, but you didn't. And why? Because I didn't look like I belonged here? Because my car was too nice for this dusty lot?" Taylor's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson, his jaw tightening as he shrank beneath the weight of Anthony's words. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came, only a faint, shaky breath. Anthony pressed on, his voice rising with a quiet, controlled power. "This isn't just about me being FBI. It's about what happens when people like you, people with authority, let bias steer your every move. I'm lucky. I had a badge to flash, a title to prove who I am. But what about the others? The men and women who don't have that shield? What happens when they're not believed? when they're denied the benefit of the doubt. His words hung in the air, a challenge and a lament, rippling outward to the crowd that had fallen silent. Every face turned toward him now, some wide-eyed with dawning realization, others cast downward in shame. Among them stood Sharon, the waitress, framed in the diner's doorway. Her apron was wrinkled from a morning of bustling between tables, her hand pressed over her mouth as tears glistened in her eyes. She hadn't called the police, but the weight of the moment pressed on her all the same. A quiet guilt for not speaking up when she'd overheard the whispers, the sidelong glances aimed at Anthony as he'd sat at the counter, sipping his coffee. Anthony exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to ground him. "We have to do better," he said, his voice softening but no less resolute as he locked eyes with Taylor. "All of us, but especially you. Because when you let bias cloud your judgment, you're not just failing me. You're failing everyone you swore to protect." Taylor's mouth opened again, but the words wouldn't come. His hands hung uselessly at his sides, his shoulders slumping as if the badge on his chest had grown too heavy to bear. Daniel, standing a step behind, gave a slow nod, his expression hardening with determination. "Agent Hayes," he said, stepping forward once more, "if there's anything I can do to make this right." Anthony shook his head, a faint, weary smile tugging at his lips. "Just do your job," he said. "Do it better than it was done today, that's all I ask." With that, he turned toward the diner, the crowd parting like a wave as he approached. Some murmured soft apologies, their voices barely audible, while others averted their eyes, the weight of their earlier suspicions now a burden they couldn't shake. Sharon met him at the door, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. "Your breakfast's on the house, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "I'm so sorry this happened." Anthony nodded, his expression softening just enough to offer her a glimpse of forgiveness. "Thank you, Sharon," he replied, stepping inside. "But I think I've lost my appetite." He paused near the counter, the diner's interior a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Worn vinyl booths, the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner, the smell of grease and coffee lingering in the air. The patrons, once buzzing with whispers, now sat in uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on him. The weight of the incident pressed down, thick and suffocating, as Anthony took a moment to steady himself. Then he turned to face the room, his voice cutting through the stillness with a calm, unyielding strength. "I've been in this position before," he began, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. "Not here, not exactly like this, but I've stood where I'm standing now, judged wrongly, accused wrongly, and I'm here today because I know I'm not alone in this. It happens every day, to people who look like me, to people who don't have a badge or the resources to shield themselves." His words carried a quiet power, shrinking the room under their weight. Even those who had eyed him warily when he'd first walked in now sat humbled, their heads bowed, their forks idle on their plates. "I parked my car out there," he continued, nodding toward the window where his sleek sedan gleamed under the morning sun. "I ordered breakfast, just like any of you might. I didn't do anything out of the ordinary. But somehow, that was enough to make me a suspect, enough for someone to call the police." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting his words sink into the cracks of their consciences. Sharon stood behind the counter, her hand trembling as it pressed against her lips, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She hadn't made the call, but she'd heard the mutterings, the hushed speculation about the man in the nice suit, the car that didn't fit the diner's usual crowd, and she hadn't said a word. Anthony turned towards the window, where a handful of onlookers still lingered, phones raised like silent witnesses. "To those recording this," he said, his voice firm, "I hope you're doing more than just catching a moment. I hope you're thinking about the story you're telling, the lesson this should teach. This isn't about one bad officer or one wrong call. It's about what happens when we let bias and fear take the wheel." His gaze shifted back to the room, landing on Taylor, who had stepped just inside the door, his hat clutched in his hands. The officer's face was pale, his jaw slack, his eyes hollow with the realization of what he'd set in motion. He opened his mouth as if to offer something, anything, but Anthony raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need an apology," he said, his tone unwavering. "What I need is accountability. What I need is for this to stop, not just for me, but for everyone. Because next time it might not end like this. Next time someone could get hurt." Taylor's head dipped, a faint nod all he could muster as the weight of his actions settled over him like a shroud. Daniel stepped forward again, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Agent Hayes, I'll make sure this gets reported, fully. It won't be buried." Anthony gave a small nod, a flicker of acknowledgement, then turned back to the room. "We all have a part to play in fixing this," he said. "It starts with questioning what we assume, speaking up when we see something wrong and holding each other to account." The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with the echoes of his words. Slowly, Anthony gathered his things, a jacket slung over his arm, a wallet tucked into his pocket, and prepared to leave. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time. "I hope the next time I stop in here," he said, a trace of wry hope in his voice, "it'll just be for breakfast." With that, he stepped outside, the gravel crunching under his shoes as he walked away, leaving the diner's patrons to wrestle with their thoughts, the day's events etched into their faces like lines on a map. But the story didn't end there. By nightfall, the parking lot encounter had spilled onto the vast, unyielding expanse of social media. Videos, grainy but vivid, showed Anthony in handcuffs, then calmly revealing his FBI badge, his voice steady as he dismantled the assumptions that had bound him. Within days, those clips had racked up millions of views, igniting a firestorm of debate. In Greensboro, the community fractured. Some residents roared with outrage, demanding Taylor's badge be stripped away, their voices echoing through town halls and online forums. Others, including a few of the diner's regulars, sat quietly with their regrets, admitting to themselves that they'd let their own snap judgments fuel the day's chaos. For Taylor, the fallout was swift and merciless. The police department launched an internal investigation, and he was sidelined to administrative leave, his name splashed across local headlines. Public officials denounced his actions, their statements ringing with calls for unbiased policing and better judgment. But for Anthony, the incident became something larger, a megaphone for a message he'd carried for years. As he watched the videos spread, he felt not triumph, but a weary resolve. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who'd faced the same scrutiny, the same injustice, without a badge to shield them. And in that truth lay the deepest lesson of all. Power, unchecked, could wound as deeply as any weapon, and justice, true justice, demanded more than apologies. It demanded change. In the weeks that unfolded after that fateful day in the courtroom, Anthony found himself thrust into a new role, one he hadn't anticipated. Invitations poured in from community centers, town halls, and local forums, each one eager to hear his story. Standing before diverse crowds, some skeptical, others hopeful, he spoke with a quiet intensity, his voice steady as he recounted the raw details of his ordeal. His dark eyes scanned the faces before him, searching for understanding, and his words carried the weight of lived experience. He didn't just share what had happened. He pleaded for change, urging better training for law enforcement in recognizing implicit bias and mastering de-escalation techniques. Each time he spoke, he felt a flicker of vulnerability, as if peeling back layers of himself, yet he pressed on, driven by the belief that his story could spark something greater. His calm demeanor, unshaken even by the memory of handcuffs and accusations, struck a chord with many. What could have been just another fleeting headline transformed into a powerful lesson, rippling through the city like a stone dropped into still water. At the diner where it all began, the air felt different too. Sharon, the waitress who'd once eyed Anthony with suspicion, now moved through her shifts with a quieter step. She and her coworkers had sat through sensitivity training, an experience that left her unsettled. She'd fidgeted in her chair as the instructor's words sank in, forcing her to confront the snap judgments she'd made that day. Her cheeks had flushed with shame as she replayed the moment she'd dialed the police, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and certainty that now felt hollow. The diner's owner, a gruff man with graying hair and a penchant for order, had taken it a step further. One morning, he'd stood on a stepladder, hammer in hand, nailing a sign near the entrance that declared in bold, unapologetic letters, "Everyone is welcome here." He'd muttered under his breath about fixing things, but Sharon saw the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as if he too carried a sliver of guilt. A few days later, the group of men who'd sparked the chaos returned. Their boots scuffed the linoleum as they shuffled in, heads bowed, avoiding the curious stares of other patrons. They'd come with an apology, their voices low and halting as they stood before Anthony, who'd wrestled with himself for days before deciding to step back into the diner. He'd sat at home the night before, staring at the flickering TV, his mind replaying their accusing glares and the cold metal of the handcuffs. Should he forgive? Could he? When he finally faced them, his posture was erect, his expression a blend of grace and steel. He accepted their words with a nod, but his gaze locked onto each man in turn, piercing through their discomfort. "Apologies are a good start," he said, his voice deliberate, each syllable a quiet hammer strike. "But real change, that happens when you pause, when you dig deep and question why you acted the way you did. That's what I need from you, not just words." The men shifted uneasily, one scratching the back of his neck, another staring at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. Anthony's words lingered, a challenge they couldn't unhear. The diner itself grew quieter in the weeks that followed. The hum of conversation softened, as if the walls themselves held their breath, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. Yet its reputation endured, whispered about in grocery lines and barbershops. The place where an FBI agent had faced down prejudice with nothing but composure and truth. It became a reluctant monument, a testament to the slow, painstaking work of building a community where every face, regardless of color or creed, could feel seen, safe, and valued. For Anthony, returning to his FBI duties felt different now. The incident clung to him, not as a shackle, but as a quiet fire. Each case he worked, each report he filed, carried a new layer of purpose. He wasn't just chasing justice for victims, he was modeling it, showing what it could and should be. His story spread beyond the city, igniting debates on national airwaves. His words, "We all have a role in making this better. It starts with questioning ourselves and holding each other accountable," echoed in articles and broadcasts, a clarion call for reflection. In the end, the ripple effect touched more than Officer Taylor, the diner's regulars, or the local community. It became a beacon of hope, proof that even in the shadow of injustice, growth was possible when people chose to pause, learn, and rise. But the story had begun in a far darker place, in the tense, shadowed corners of a parking lot behind the courthouse. Officer Gregson's boots pounded the concrete, the sound sharp and urgent as it bounced off the gray walls. His hand clutched his radio, fingers white-knuckled as he barked into it. "I've got him! Suspect matches the description perfectly!" His voice crackled with triumph, his chest swelling with the certainty of a job well done. He flicked his eyes toward the man he'd detained, a tall black man in a crisp navy suit, briefcase in hand, standing with an almost unnerving calm. Gregson's grip tightened on the man's arm, though there was no struggle, no hint of resistance. The man's eyes met his, steady and unflinching, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You're making a mistake," he said, low and even, a statement more than a plea. Gregson snorted, casting a quick glance at his partner, Officer Daniels, who lingered a few steps away, brow furrowed in confusion. "Yeah, well, that's not your call," Gregson shot back, his tone dripping with dismissal. "The court'll figure it out." The accusation was flimsy, a string of petty thefts downtown, pinned on a vague profile. Tall black male, early 40s. To Gregson, it was enough. The man's polished suit, the quiet dignity in his stance, didn't compute. He saw only a suspect, another box to check. The walk to the courthouse was a taut, silent march. Gregson kept one hand near his holster, his jaw clenched as if bracing for a fight, though the man beside him moved with a poise that seemed almost defiant. His eyes swept the bustling streets, cars honking, pedestrians weaving through the midday chaos, yet his face betrayed no fear, no flicker of anger. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere thickened. The wooden benches creaked as people settled in, their whispers buzzing like static. "Looks like Gregson nabbed another one," someone muttered from the back, a mix of boredom and curiosity in their tone. The man, still clutching his briefcase, leaned close to Gregson as they neared the judge's bench. "You're going to regret this," he murmured, his voice so soft it was nearly lost in the shuffle, yet it carried an edge that made Gregson's smirk twitch. The courtroom hummed with anticipation as Gregson stood tall, shoulders squared, his chest puffed out like a hunter displaying a prize. The man beside him remained silent, his polished shoes glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the scuffed linoleum floor. The judge, an older man with deep lines etched into his face and a perpetually weary gaze, shuffled through a stack of papers before looking up. "Officer, please present your case," he said, his voice gravelly but firm. Gregson stepped forward, clearing his throat with a dramatic flourish. "Your Honor, this man matches the description from multiple witnesses. Tall black male, early 40s. Fits the thefts downtown last week like a glove." His words rang with conviction, though they seemed to strain under their own weight, as if begging the room to agree. The judge's eyebrow arched, a subtle crack in his stoic facade, and he turned to the accused. "Sir, would you care to state your name for the record?" The man set his briefcase down with a soft thud, adjusted his tie with deliberate care, and straightened. "My name is Malcolm Avery," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I'm a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The room froze, the air sucked out in a collective gasp. Gregson's smirk flickered, a fleeting shadow of doubt crossing his face before he masked it with a scowl. "Your Honor, I don't see how his job changes the facts," he snapped. But Malcolm's gaze shifted to him, sharp as a blade. "It's relevant," Malcolm said, his tone unwavering, "because it exposes the recklessness of your actions. You detained me without cause, based on nothing but a vague description." The words landed like stones, heavy and deliberate, and the tension in the room coiled tighter. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, his eyes darting between the two men as the drama unfolded. For Gregson, this was unraveling fast. He'd pictured a quick, clean arrest, another notch on his belt, another day done. But Malcolm Avery wasn't just a man. He was a force, a living pillar of the law Gregson had misjudged. Still, Gregson clung to his stance, unwilling to concede. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, silencing the murmurs that had erupted like a swarm of bees. "Mr. Avery," he said, his voice measured, "are you suggesting this arrest lacked merit?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "Baseless is too kind a word, Your Honor. I was leaving my office for lunch, carrying nothing but this." He tapped his briefcase, the sound crisp in the stillness. "When Officer Gregson stopped me, I asked why, and all he offered was that I matched the description. No evidence, no cause, just an assumption." Gregson shifted, his boots squeaking against the floor. "Your Honor, the description came from witnesses, multiple witnesses. This isn't about assumptions, it's about leads." His voice rose, defensive now, but Malcolm turned to face him fully, his expression a storm held in check. "Leads?" he said, his tone cutting. "You mean stereotypes. Did you even ask for specifics, or did you just grab the first black man in a suit you saw?" The room inhaled sharply, a ripple of gasps breaking the silence. Gregson's jaw locked, his face reddening as he stammered, "That's not fair." "Fair," Malcolm interjected, his voice rising just enough to seize the room. "Do you know how often men like me are stopped, questioned, hauled in for nothing but fitting the description? I've dedicated my life to justice, officer, and what you did today mocks it." The judge raised a hand, his expression flickering with something. Curiosity, perhaps. or unease. "Gentlemen, enough," he said, though his tone hinted at fascination. He nodded to Malcolm. "Mr. Avery, continue, but keep it brief." Malcolm stepped forward, his presence filling the space, his eyes sweeping the room. "Your Honor, this isn't just about me. It's a glimpse into a deeper rot, when assumptions trump evidence, when bias blinds judgment. Innocence becomes a casualty. Justice isn't served by reckless power, it's eroded." The courtroom fell silent, every ear straining, every eye locked on him. Gregson's bravado withered, his shoulders hunching as the weight of Malcolm's words pressed down. And as Malcolm adjusted his tie, drawing a slow breath, it was clear this moment would echo far beyond those walls, a stark reminder that unchecked authority could fracture the very justice it claimed to uphold. In the dimly lit courtroom, Malcolm Avery stood tall, his piercing gaze locked onto Officer Gregson, who fidgeted nervously with the edge of his notepad. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation as Malcolm's voice cut through the silence. "You told this court that the description of the suspect came from multiple witnesses," he said, his tone steady but laced with an undercurrent of challenge. "So, officer, why don't you enlighten us? What exactly did those witnesses say?" Gregson hesitated, his eyes darting to the scribbled notes in his hands as if they might shield him from the growing scrutiny. "Tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark jacket," he mumbled, his voice shrinking into something barely audible, a shadow of the confidence he'd strode in with. Malcolm's brow arched, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "That's it?" he pressed, stepping closer, his presence commanding the room. "No distinguishing marks, no specific behavior, not even a hint about the jacket's style or color? Just a vague sketch that could fit half the men walking these streets?" Gregson's silence hung like a weight, his lips parting but no words escaping. The tension swelled, wrapping around the onlookers like a tightening coil. Malcolm turned to the judge, his voice rising with purpose. "Your Honor, this is the heart of the issue. Vague descriptions breed lazy policing. Instead of digging for facts, officers like Gregson leap to conclusions. Conclusions that too often shatter the lives of black men across this city." The judge, perched high on his bench, remained an unreadable statue, his face carved from stone. Yet his fingers betrayed him, tapping a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the polished wood. "Mr. Avery," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, "are you suggesting this goes beyond a single mistake? That this is a symptom of something larger?" Malcolm squared his shoulders, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. "I'm not suggesting, Your Honor, I'm declaring it outright." And he pivoted, his eyes sweeping the courtroom, addressing not just the judge, but every soul packed into the pews. "I've watched this pattern unfold too many times. Young men dragged off street corners for no crime but standing there. Fathers pinned to the pavement, wrists bound, their children's cries echoing in their ears, all because someone decided they looked suspicious. How many of these stories ever reach a courtroom? How many families are torn apart by reckless assumptions?" Gregson shifted in his seat, his earlier swagger crumbling into unease. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his fingers tightening around his notes as if they could anchor him. Malcolm wasn't just defending himself, he was peeling back the layers of Gregson's actions, exposing the shaky ground they stood on. "Officer Gregson," Malcolm said, his voice sharpening as he turned back to the man. "Did you know I was a federal prosecutor when you pulled me over?" Gregson's face flushed a deep crimson, his eyes dropping to the floor. "No," he admitted, the words stumbling out like a confession. "I didn't." Malcolm's response was calm but sliced like a blade. "Of course you didn't. You didn't ask. You didn't check my ID. You didn't bother to verify a single thing. You trusted your gut, and that gut wasn't chasing justice. It was chasing prejudice." The room fell silent, the only sound a faint rustle from the gallery as someone shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm let the quiet stretch, a deliberate pause that weighed on everyone present. Then he faced the judge again, his tone resolute. "Your Honor, I'm not here to crucify this officer. I'm here to demand accountability. If this can happen to me, a man who's spent years upholding the law, imagine what happens to those without a voice. Justice isn't served by brushing this aside. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he considered Malcolm's words, the gravity of the moment settling over him like a storm cloud. But the judge's attention shifted, his gaze landing heavily on Gregson. "Officer," he began, his voice firm yet measured, like a teacher addressing a wayward student. "Do you have anything to add in your defense?" Gregson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as the last traces of his bravado slipped away. "Your Honor, I was just following procedure," he stammered, his hands twisting together. "I didn't mean—" Malcolm cut in, his voice a whip crack through the faltering excuse. "If this is procedure, then it's time we rip those procedures apart and start over." The judge raised a hand, silencing Malcolm with a stern glance. "Mr. Avery, let him finish." Gregson's eyes flicked between the judge and Malcolm, desperation creeping into his tone. "I thought I was doing my job. I didn't mean to single anyone out unfairly." Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression softening just enough to hint at understanding, though his voice held its edge. "That's the problem, officer. Bias doesn't knock on the door and introduce itself. It hides in your instincts, in the split-second choices you make under the guise of just doing your job. But the damage it leaves behind? That's real. That's devastating." The courtroom held its breath, Malcolm's words sinking deep into the wood-paneled walls. He turned to the gallery, his voice swelling with conviction. "I've spent my life fighting for a system that's fair, not just for the privileged few, but for everyone. But no system can heal itself if we refuse to see its flaws." The judge cleared his throat, pulling the room's focus back to him. "Mr. Avery, you've made your case clear. What do you propose as a resolution?" Malcolm paused, his mind racing as he weighed his words like stones in his palm. "Your Honor, I don't crave revenge. I crave accountability. Officer Gregson needs to face the harm he's caused, not just to me, but to the trust people place in this system." Gregson's face tightened, a flush of shame creeping up his neck, but he didn't protest. He stared at his hands, the truth finally piercing through his defenses. Malcolm pressed on, his voice steady with purpose. "Let this be a pivot point, not just for him, but for all of us. If we don't wrestle with our biases, they'll keep rotting the roots of justice." The judge exhaled slowly, his gavel resting lightly in his grip as he surveyed the room. His eyes lingered on Malcolm's unyielding stance, then drifted to Gregson's bowed head, and finally swept over the hushed crowd. "This case isn't merely about a wrongful stop," he said, his voice ringing with authority tinged with reflection. "It's about the values we swear to protect in this room and beyond it." He fixed his stare on Gregson, who seemed to shrink under its weight. "Officer Gregson, your actions today reveal a troubling lapse in judgment. You may have thought you were within the law, but your reliance on a flimsy description and your failure to seek evidence show a reckless disregard for due process." Gregson gave a faint nod, his lips pressed into a thin line, his silence louder than any excuse. The judge turned to Malcolm, his tone softening slightly. "Mr. Avery, your clarity and restraint in exposing these deeper flaws are remarkable. I see the anger simmering beneath your composure, and rightly so. Yet you've transformed that frustration into a call for all of us to look harder at ourselves." Malcolm dipped his head in quiet acknowledgement, a gesture of respect laced with resolve. The judge straightened, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Officer Gregson, I'm ordering you to complete mandatory training on implicit bias and community relations. You will also submit a formal written apology to Mr. Avery. Furthermore, I'm directing the police department to reassess its policies on detaining suspects based on vague profiles alone." A murmur rippled through the room. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others nodded as if the ruling scratched an itch long ignored. Gregson lifted his gaze to Malcolm, his eyes clouded with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and rough, lacking polish but carrying a thread of sincerity. Malcolm studied him for a heartbeat, then offered a curt nod. I hope this sparks change, officer, for you and for the system you're part of. As the courtroom began to empty, Malcolm stood rooted, his presence a quiet force even as the crowd thinned. A young reporter darted forward, microphone trembling slightly in her grip. Mr. Avery, any comments on today's outcome? Malcolm faced the camera, his voice unwavering. Justice isn't a finish line, it's a road we walk together. That road demands we confront the systems and biases dragging us backward. We can't turn away. We have to do better. The reporter lowered her mic, and Malcolm turned, briefcase swinging lightly at his side. Outside, the sun bathed the courthouse steps in golden light, casting long shadows as he descended. The weight of the day clung to him, not as a burden, but as fuel. This wasn't the end, just a spark in a much larger fire. He knew the fight for fairness stretched far beyond one courtroom, one officer, one case. A small crowd lingered at the base of the steps, some tipping their heads in quiet reverence, others murmuring about the drama they'd witnessed. Malcolm paused, gazing out over the city's bustling streets, the hum of life rolling on as if untouched by the morning's reckoning. But he saw the truth. Change, even incremental, was born in moments like these. Not in grand gestures, but in the gritty push to hold power accountable. He turned to the camera crews hovering nearby, his voice steady and resonant. Accountability isn't about one man or one ruling. It's about all of us asking the tough questions, rejecting easy outs, and demanding more for everyone. With that, he walked off, the echo of his words lingering like a challenge in the air. The lesson here stretched beyond Gregson's humbled stance or the judge's measured ruling. It was a stark reminder that power, unchecked, could twist justice into a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. Malcolm's stand wasn't just a personal victory, it was a mirror held up to a society too comfortable with its flaws. As he vanished into the city's pulse, the question lingered. What biases do we carry, unnoticed, in our own hearts? Justice, he'd shown, wasn't a gift handed down. It was a choice, forged in the courage to demand better day after day.